What if I told you that everything you learned about the serpent in Genesis is wrong? That story that was taught to you in Sunday school or Bible study meetings may be missing something much bigger. The original Hebrew term used for serpent is nachash. And here's what makes this interesting. Yes, it is often translated as serpent or snake, but this meaning is not as simple as it seems. In fact, nachash doesn't just refer to a crawling reptile. The term is also linked to verbs such as whisper or enchant, often associated with divination or obtaining occult knowledge. That is, the word used to describe the serpent in Genesis may actually suggest a seeker or transmitter of esoteric knowledge. If you're thinking this sounds a lot deeper than simply a deceiving animal, you're on the right track. In ancient Middle Eastern cultures, snakes were more than just slithering animals. They carried powerful symbolism. In Mesopotamian mythology, for example, there are references to the god Enki, often associated with images of snakes. He was a giver of wisdom and knowledge. In Egypt, snakes were not just dangerous creatures. They were sacred. The uraeus, the iconic snake in the pharaoh's crown, symbolized divine authority and protection. In Canaanite traditions, snakes were linked to healing and transformation. Does this really sound like an evil and treacherous being to you? With this historical context, an intriguing question arises. Was the serpent in Genesis really portrayed as a purely evil being? Or does it represent a much more complex symbol? Was the serpent trying to lead Eve into sin, or was he instead offering her and Adam a path to knowledge and enlightenment? These are not new ideas. They have long been discussed in academic circles and in alternative interpretations. But they rarely make it into popular discourse because they question the narrative that has been accepted for centuries. Now let's focus specifically on Genesis 3. The serpent's interaction with Eve is fascinating. She doesn't impose anything, doesn't force her to do anything. Instead, he asks questions, defies the divine prohibition with logic and curiosity. Is that really what God said? This is not the speech of any deceiver. He seems more like a provocateur, a challenger to the norm, perhaps even a teacher. What about the fruit? Traditionally depicted as an apple, but the text only refers to it as the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The serpent's role here is not simply to tempt Eve with something evil, but rather to point her towards something transformative. After eating the fruit, what happens? Adam and Eve gain knowledge. Their eyes open and they realize they are naked. They become vulnerable, aware of themselves in ways they weren't before. Doesn't this seem like a fundamental leap in human consciousness? The question remains, was the serpent really villainous, or was it playing an essential role in the awakening of humanity? And perhaps more importantly, why has this role been so demonized throughout history? Was it just convenient to associate the serpent with Satan? Because, an important detail, the original Hebrew Bible does not identify the serpent as Satan. This interpretation was added centuries later as the tradition evolved. If the serpent in Genesis is not just a literal reptile, we need to ask an even bigger question. Why a serpent? Why would the author of Genesis choose this specific symbol to represent such a pivotal moment in human history? To understand this, we must explore the symbolism of snakes in several ancient cultures, and what we discover could completely change the way you see this creature. Let's start with Egypt. There, snakes were not seen as symbols of evil. The uraeus, the iconic snake used by the pharaohs, was a divine emblem of protection and power. She was not just an adornment, it was a symbol of order, divine authority, and even immortality. Now compare this to the serpent in Genesis, which is at the center of a narrative about cosmic order and its disruption. Coincidence? Probably not. In Mesopotamia, snakes played an equally intriguing role. Consider the god Enki, a central figure in Sumerian mythology, Often depicted with flowing waters and serpentine images, Enki was the god of wisdom, magic, and life-giving waters. He was a benefactor, someone who shared knowledge with humanity, sometimes against the wishes of other gods. Does this sound familiar? And the Canaanites? They greatly influenced the biblical world, and for them, snakes were associated with transformation and healing. Have you ever heard of the stick with two snakes entwined? This is the caduceus, a symbol still used in medicine today. Serpents were seen as powerful agents of change, neither good nor evil, but forces capable of bringing renewal or destruction, depending on how they were approached. Greek mythology also has relevant connections. Although the story of Genesis predates classical Greek mythology, the similarities are striking. In many Greek myths, serpents guarded sacred treasures or forbidden knowledge. For example, in the Garden of the Hesperides, a serpent named Ladon protected the golden apples of immortality, apples, forbidden fruit, a garden. It's easy to see how these myths could have influenced each other. Now comes the really fascinating part, the double symbolism of the serpent. In almost all ancient cultures, snakes were not seen as a single thing. They were revered for their wisdom and feared for their poison. They represented life and death, creation and destruction. They crossed borders, moving between the earth and the underworld, between the sacred and the profane. Ancient Semitic languages, including Hebrew, often used wordplay and hidden meanings to convey deeper ideas. The word nakash shares linguistic roots with terms meaning to shine or to be luminous. Some scholars even draw parallels between Nachash and celestial figures, such as an angelic or divine being. Another intriguing detail, the Hebrew term arum, used to describe the serpent, is often translated as cunning or shrewd. But this word can also have a neutral meaning, implying intelligence or discernment. This completely changes the reading of the text. Was the serpent being deceptive or just defying an established norm? Let's now analyze what the snake actually does in the narrative. She doesn't lie through her teeth. It asks a question. Is that really what God said? When Eve responds, the serpent argues, "You will not die immediately. Your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Here's the big question. Everything the serpent said actually happened. Adam and Eve do not drop dead after eating the fruit. Instead, his eyes open. They gain insight, just as the serpent predicted. This leads us to reflect. Did the serpent really deceive Eve, or did it just reveal a truth that was being hidden from her? This brings us to another critical point. Why was the tree of knowledge of good and evil prohibited? The text does not say that the tree was evil, only that it conferred knowledge. This is a crucial detail. The serpent was not tempting Eve with something evil. He was offering her something humans have always sought: understanding. The desire for knowledge is one of the most fundamental aspects of humanity, from mythology to modern science. In the heart of the garden, God gave a clear instruction not to eat the fruit of the tree located in the center, nor even touch it, under penalty of death. This warning, however, was directly challenged by the serpent, who questioned the severity of this consequence by stating, "You shall not surely die." In fact, when Adam and Eve consume the forbidden fruit, they do not immediately drop dead. Instead, your perceptions expand, and awareness of your nakedness emerges. Thus a dilemma arises. Had the serpent lied, or did the divine warning refer to a symbolic, perhaps spiritual death, a rupture in the connection between the human being and the divine? Regardless of the interpretation, one point is undeniable. The serpent's promise of knowledge turned out to be true, as they gained an understanding of good and evil. The central question revolves around this knowledge. What does it really mean to discern between good and evil? Since the beginnings of biblical interpretation, scholars have debated the meaning of this expression. For some, it is about the moral ability to distinguish between right and wrong. For others, It represents autonomy, freedom of decision, without depending on divine direction. In any case, this event marks a watershed in the human trajectory, with the snake acting as the agent of this transformation. An intriguing point is God's own response to what happened. In Genesis 3:22, he declares that man became as one of us, knowing good and evil. This confirms, in a way, the serpent's statement. The human being has truly acquired a new level of understanding. So a provocative question arises. Was the serpent a deceiver, or merely revealing an uncomfortable truth? Her role was not merely that of a transgressor of the rules of Eden, but rather that of an instigator of change, forever modifying humanity's relationship with the Creator. Furthermore, the serpent reconfigures the dynamics of the Garden of Eden. His role is not limited to temptation, but to challenging the structure where knowledge and authority were centralized in God. By persuading Eve, she leads humanity into a new existence, one where choices and consequences become inevitable. And herein lies another often overlooked point. Eve does not act impulsively. She analyzes the serpent's words, evaluates the tree, and makes a conscious choice. Adam, on the other hand, accepts the fruit without question, which raises new reflections on their respective positions in the narrative. Interestingly, the serpent is not destroyed by God. His punishment is to crawl on the ground and feed on dust. This may indicate an attempt to neutralize its influence without completely eradicating it. Does this condemnation simply symbolize a reconfiguration of his role in the cosmos? The text does not clarify directly, but this interpretation is plausible. It is worth mentioning that ancient Jewish interpretations brought different perspectives on the serpent. In the Talmud, for example, there are suggestions that she was not merely a reptile, but a creature with human or even divine characteristics. In certain reports, she was seen as a being endowed with intelligence and speech, having her own purpose within the narrative, and not just an agent of temptation. Another fundamental text for this discussion is the Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish writing that circulated widely in the Second Temple period. It addresses the idea of supernatural beings interacting with humans, bringing forbidden knowledge. Although the book does not explicitly mention the serpent of Genesis, it establishes a cultural backdrop where entities that defy divine orders play roles of revelation and transgression. In early Christianity, the identity of the serpent underwent a significant transformation. In the Book of Revelation, 12:9, she is directly associated with Satan, being called the dragon, the ancient serpent. This connection is not present in the original text of Genesis, but it has become a widely accepted interpretation. The question is, why was this association made? To understand this, it is necessary to consider the intellectual environment of the time, influenced by dualistic systems such as Gnosticism and Zoroastrianism. These traditions emphasized a cosmic struggle between good and evil, where the serpent was seen as a symbol of rebellion against divine order. Within some Gnostic aspects, the serpent is seen not as a villain, but as a liberator. That's right. In certain Gnostic texts, the creator of the material world, often identified as the demiurge, was considered a tyrannical being who kept humanity in ignorance. From this perspective, by encouraging Eve to eat the fruit, the serpent fulfilled a role of emancipation, offering the necessary knowledge for humans to reach a higher state of consciousness. This interpretation was rejected by the early church, but it illustrates how the figure of the serpent can take on multiple facets, from deceiving to revealing truth. The ambiguity of the serpent also manifests itself in other biblical passages. In Numbers 21, Moses raises a bronze serpent in the desert to heal the Israelites, who had been bitten by poisonous snakes. This episode creates a paradox. The same symbol associated with the fall of humanity becomes an instrument of salvation. This reinforces a recurring theme in Scripture, the duality of symbols and their ability to represent both destruction and redemption. The symbolism of the serpent dates back to mythologies much older than Genesis. In Mesopotamian literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh features a serpent that steals a plant of immortality from the hero, thwarting his quest for eternal life. This myth shares strikingly similar elements to the Eden story: a garden, forbidden knowledge, and a serpent that alters human destiny. In Canaanite tradition, serpents were often associated with fertility and divine power. The god Baal, for example, in some accounts fights a monstrous serpent, a theme that echoes in Hebrew mythology and may have influenced the representation of the serpent in Genesis. Egypt also offers fascinating parallels. Wadjet, the snake goddess, was a protector of the pharaohs, symbolizing power and wisdom. At the same time, Apophis, the great serpent of chaos, was the destructive force that fought the sun god Ra. This double meaning of serpents as protectors and threats is reflected in the complexity of the Serpent of Eden. If we analyze the Ugaritic myths, we find the figure of Kothar Wakasis, an artificer god associated with occult knowledge, often represented with serpentine symbolism. This link between serpents and wisdom may have influenced the view of the Serpent of Eden as a mediator between the human and the divine. Given this, how can we reinterpret the serpent of Genesis? The biblical account is not just a story about obedience, but about humanity's transition from innocence to conscience. The snake acts as a catalyst for this change. Before the fruit episode, Adam and Eve lived in a state of naive obedience. Afterwards, they become responsible for their choices. This can be seen not just as a fall, but as an awakening. The very concept of the tree of knowledge raises profound questions. Why did God put it there if his intention was that man would not eat its fruit? Was it a test, a provocation, or an opportunity in disguise? The serpent presents the tree as a path to enlightenment, not as a threat. This perspective does not mean that the serpent was benign, but it does suggest that Genesis is more than a simple morality tale. The serpent's punishment is equally symbolic, crawling on the earth and feeding on dust. This represents a loss of status, the reduction of her previous position as mediator between divine and human spheres. Likewise, the expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden is not an end, but a beginning. They are thrown into the world to face challenges, build civilizations, and develop their own history. The role of the serpent, far from being just that of a deceiver, inaugurates this human journey. The Genesis account, when analyzed from different perspectives, reveals itself to be a rich and multifaceted narrative. The serpent, far from being a one-dimensional figure, carries layers of symbolism that cross cultures, mythologies, and religions. Her role transcends temptation. She provokes, questions, and transforms, becoming one of the most intriguing characters in biblical tradition.